Hey, so good afternoon and welcome to the first talk of the Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series for winter 2021 term. My name is Ruth Shedd. I am a Cree member of Peguis First Nation. My role at the University of Manitoba is Director of Indigenous Engagement and Communications, and that's within the Office of the Vice President Indigenous. I want to begin today by acknowledging our relations. I honor our dependence on and our responsibility to protect the land and the water. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojibwe Cree, the Dakota, the Dene peoples, and it's on the homeland of the Métis Nation. The water that we drink in the city of Winnipeg, that's where I'm coming to you from today. It comes from Shoal Lake 40, and the electricity that we're using to host today's session comes from Treaty 5 territory. Today, I'm also thinking about those who are working to protect us from COVID-19 and all of the educators who are continuing to work with students in classrooms. And I'm keeping those who have lost loved ones and others who may be struggling with physical or mental health in mind, in heart, and in prayer. The Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series, launched in 2018, the talks highlight the research and expertise of Indigenous scholars at the University of Manitoba. Today, we are very lucky to be hearing from an individual who is not only shaping the landscape of learning at the university, but beyond campus, his work is transforming the lives of students and educators and the field of education as a whole. At the end of the session, there will be some time for questions and answers. So if you have a question for our speaker today, you can use the chat function on Zoom, or you can leave a comment in the comment section on Facebook. Both are being monitored. If you are on Zoom, can you please make sure that you remain muted during the presentation? And now I'm very honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Frank Deer, who helped me with some pronunciation of some words earlier, and I hope I get them right when I read a little bit of his bio. So Dr. Deer is an Associate Professor of Education. He's a Canada Research Chair, and he is a member of the Royal Society of Canada. He works in the Faculty of Education and is Ganegihaga from Ganawage, a community that lies just south of Jojake. Dr. Deer holds an earned PhD in Educational Administration from the University of Saskatchewan and is published in the area of Indigenous education. Dr. Deer conducts research on Indigenous language education and Indigenous religious and spiritual orientations. He has previously served as a classroom teacher in northern Manitoba and in inner city of Winnipeg. Today, his talk is called Morality and Indigenous Consciousness, the Importance of Archetypes. And I will pass it over to Dr. Deer.
Hello, everybody. Sagam. It's a pleasure to be here. Now I'll go to Ruth with that introduction. I am Ganegihaga. To use the exonym, Mohawk, and of the Mohawk Nation. I am from Ganawage, which is just south of Jojage. The term you would understand is, or are familiar with, is Montreal. The word Jojage is could be taken to mean where two rivers or currents converge. And this is in reference to the St. Lawrence and the Ottawa River coming together, and then it goes to the northeast. I'm coming to you from my basement. I almost said the Faculty of Education, but it's interesting doing these Zoom meetings, which I don't do enough of, and the difference between being in a meeting where you interface with people and then having to do something like this, speak on a topic of academic interest is a bit different, right? In one case, you're talking with people. In this case, I'm talking at people. But I hope there's interest in posing any questions that might emerge at the end of this. I do come from the Faculty of Education. I am an elementary school teacher by trade. As Ruth mentioned, I worked in the North. I've worked in the city and elsewhere. And some of what I'm about to talk about takes me back to those times where you are helping students, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, learn about things that we value and are find of interest and are grounded in, for the most part, the mores of literacy instruction and numeracy instruction and so on. It's only now at middle age where I'm becoming to appreciate some of the things that are resident within those explorations in the classroom, and some of the opportunities that are on offer for community sources, if you want to call it that, of consciousness that might be resident in stories, maybe resident in literatures that you use, or in how you engage with the community and so on. So my program of research is actually on language education and the administration of language, Indigenous, specifically language education. So it's not, this talk isn't about Indigenous language education, but the topic emerges from it. And it's not something I planned on doing, but now it's become such an interest, because if you can imagine this, speaking to people in communities about their views on language use, about meaning that's resident in those languages, and how language is perhaps brought to bear in programming in schools. They'll talk about those sort of things whilst using reference, examples to communicate what they think they believe they value. And frequently, and this has been true in some of the research I've done over the years, and it's certainly been resident in others, that let's call it belief systems of various sorts emerge from those conversations, to the point where there's so much focus on those belief systems that it's sort of something that you can't overlook. And if you spend time in even public school classrooms now, but certainly First Nation schools in now or in the recent past, you might notice a more freer, if you will, integration of belief systems, even if nominally they're not regarded as so. And I'll have a few examples to offer you to sort of bring this to bear, but I'm going to focus on stories, whether they're stories that are resident in the printed word, whether they're through oral discourse of variety forms, whether they're story work, storytelling, or so on. But the focus here is how students may learn about these elements of belief systems, specifically morality, through the use of archetypes. So I'm from Kahnawake, which is, as I said, just south of Montreal. And one thing about living there is I was in a language immersion program. I'm just going to share my screen here if I can get that going. And it was sometimes said that the language program was one of the first post 1969 white paper era. Sorry, can you confirm that, Ruth? Thumbs up if you see the PowerPoint. Yeah, awesome. And I was part of a language immersion program from, I think it was 1979 or 1980, one of those years in which kindergarten started for me. And the language and stories in the language were shared. And not just in Mohawk, as I'll explore a little bit here. And those first attempts when I was in, let's say, elementary school to engage with morality weren't something that I articulated as a young boy. And it's quite possible that the teachers of the time didn't intend to situate morality in the programming in the way that I might explore here, but it certainly was there. The explorations that you might recognize nowadays are the ubiquitous use of the 7 teachings in schools you've heard of, which may be regarded, amongst other things, as a moral framework of sorts. And the use of it, the exploration of it, the invitation of community members to discuss these sort of things puts a certain form of morality on offer for students to engage with. And that might be used to supplement other explorations that may not be resident in programming nominally, but they're no doubt there. I sometimes tussle with the idea that because of the prevalence of Christianity in our communities, in our dare I say Western world, that perhaps is the tacitly understood set of moral imperatives that whether we acknowledge it or not are certainly a part of many people's consciousness. And growing up, and it was lovely to hear some of the people in the previous meeting talk about their ties to their communities and how their Christian upbringing might have been sort of done at the expense of something that is more grassroots, if you will. But others, for others, maybe it was something that was integrated to some extent. And that was certainly the case where I grew up. It was a Roman Catholic, French Roman Catholic community, and I was even taught by a nun. If there's anybody who knows their Eastern language education initiatives well, then you'll recognize the name Dorothy Lazor. At the time when she was teaching me, she was Sister Dorothy Lazor. She was affiliated with the church. So that's where I'm from. And I just want to, and this might sound at the end like an opportunity for me to glorify one particular story, and it probably is, but it's one that I think is important to share. And I'll have some references shortly to explore that. But there's two principal elements to this talk, okay? And they're resident in the title. The first of which is morality. So morality can be summed up, and there was a professor at University of California, San Diego, who put it together quite well. This is not what's resident here, but it's just coming to mind that it relates to human character and behavior that may be in that spectrum, if you will, between what we understand to be good or bad, to be desired and undesired, to be in relation to the actions that we might call ethical, right? But as Dina Cola once wrote, moral considerations can compel our attention and can trouble or ease our minds. I don't think it would take any of us terribly long to think of an instance where a moral consideration was so pressing, that was so important, that may require some sort of form of diplomacy or exploration of, okay, what do I do in this particular situation? So the responsibility for teachers of all sorts, in my case, I'm going to focus on the elementary for a moment anyway, student and the teachers who might have the opportunity to help them learn. The idea of morality has to be situated in something, okay? It may not be understood to be helpful to say, this is moral principle X, and you either do this or you do that, and you're either on the good side of morality or on the bad side of morality. It doesn't really work like that. It's not terribly helpful. And it certainly trivializes the exercise of understanding what's right or what's good. There have been some ideas about how morality might be understood. Certainly its sources for morality. I've had conversations with people of various denominations, for instance, who have spoken about their views on morality and what either provides understanding for that, whether it's something that is we can call spiritual, something that might be biblical, and so on, or it could be something that maybe isn't as simple as saying that it comes from a particular source. That however dated that source might be, they're dated, therefore meaning it's been used, it's been perhaps reified for the present, right? One Scottish philosopher once focused on morality as a means of organizing your understanding of moral responsibilities and having to navigate them. And W.D. Ross was his name, and he had I made a note here, a 6-part understanding. It didn't really last very long. It's sort of been dissected to death by now, but I think it's an interesting place to start here, where we have what might be referred to as conscientiousness, promise keeping, is one concern. Fidelity is another. Gratitude or giving thanks. I'm going to get back to giving of thanks in a bit. It's really quite important. The importance of justice is the fourth. Self-improvement is the fifth, and not non-malfeasance, not doing harm to others, for instance, is another concern. And sometimes, and maybe this is readily understandable, the focus or exercise of one may come at the expense of another, right? So it's one way of understanding how we navigate these things. And if you've been in administration in a place like a school or a university, or in a political environment for which somebody, perhaps yourself, has authority for making a decision in an arena of divergent interests and limited resources, then those decisions might be quite difficult to make. And it becomes, in many ways, or it can become a moral consideration of sorts. So that's that first bit, morality and how it's resident in programming. But another element of this talk is going to be that of archetypes. Those of you who've spent time in literature classes and arts or in native studies have certainly had opportunity to interface with archetypes. It's sometimes credited to Jung, and psychologists have explored this quite well about what archetypes are, how they may be understood. You can understand them to be a number of things. They're usually regarded as a set of characteristics of sorts. They're not particular characteristics, or they shouldn't be regarded as such, right? So the archetype of the hero, which is something I'll come back to, I hope, which was written perhaps best by Joseph Campbell many years ago. It's not just a set of leadership or initiative or so on, but there are an aggregation, it could be understood, of elements that create the archetype, right? So it is a set of characteristics, as I write here, behaviors and other patterns. Chris Booker wrote a lovely book about 15 years ago about the 7 great stories. It's very interesting, I would suggest it. But to wax psychological for a moment, these aggregate ideas exist in a manner to transform the person, or at least have the opportunity to transform at a certain level. And I suppose I mean transformation in almost a Freire sense. The idea that conscientization, if you're a reader of that, sorry, long morning already. It's an opportunity to embed into the consciousness that might have the opportunity to explore or journey through the moral landscape that is communities, that is the commons in which we all exist. So Christopher Booker, I mentioned a moment ago, his quote there. I'm going to read something just a moment here that's perhaps more extensive and critical to the way in which I'm laying out archetypes here, those set of ideas that might be tied to a particular person or a particular phenomenon. In his 2004 book, he writes, archetypes are the ancient riverbeds along which our psychic current naturally flows. It is only on this level of the archetypal structures that the basic meaning and purpose of the patterns underlying storytelling can be found. That last bit, it seems to me quite important. It's the archetypal structures that the basic meaning and purpose of the patterns underlying storytelling can be found. Meaning and purpose. So it's not just an understanding of how meaning and purpose is resident in a story or an archetype of sorts, but in the Jungian sense, if the archetypes are something that an individual interfaces with in a deliberate way, then it's possible that meaning and purpose becomes resident in the person themselves. I hope I'm not doing disservice to Jung by putting it like that. So the meaning and purpose is something that I think is important, and I hope to pick up on in the next few minutes. But I'm going to talk first about how this was engaged with, and maybe more on the side of morality, because the archetype issue didn't really emerge until later in my upbringing, and that might be the same for many. and how morality might be engaged with. Some of you might recognize the lovely collection of books. They were put together by Daphne Ojig, and they were one of the first opportunities, and I was very young, first for me, I should say, opportunities to explore the possibilities of literature in which morality was really quite resident and almost celebrated in a sense. I got to watch my time here, don't I? And each story has this character, which is arguably an archetype onto itself, that of Nanabush. Sometimes referred to as the trickster. The trickster character is not unique just to Indigenous peoples, and the world over there are these characters. I think it was somewhere in Scandinavia where this character Loki was one of their principal troublemakers in their stories, if you want to put it that way. But on the topic of Daphne Ojig's work here, there are opportunities for youth to come to understand how morality is come to be understood in these one examples, right? So one of the ones I remember, I'll do this quickly because I got to get to other things here, but the one story from Nanabush loses his eyeballs is one example of this. If you pick this up, I'm pretty sure it's in our library here at the U of M or there at the U of M. Nanabush in these stories is one who is exploring his friends, these friendly creatures. He's regarded as a spirit in these stories, by the way, as opposed to something perhaps more human of sorts, even though his image is what it is here. And he sort of has conversations with the squirrel, and the squirrel is not bothered by Nanabush's preoccupation to just have fun, because the squirrel has things to do. He interfaces with his friends the ducks, who are playing a game where they're throwing their eyeballs around, which leads to Nanabush, because he's not honoring his promises to be careful, loses his own eyeballs later. And in this, captured in this image, was when he interfaced with the beaver and wished to just play, to race up the creek. But the beaver was busy, was preoccupied with things that really mattered to them. So it's a perhaps simple, and I say archetypes aren't necessarily something to dive into at this point because it's just not as extant a story enough, but certainly the initial opportunities for youth to explore morality through these considerations of how Nanabush navigated these things, how he learned from these exercises is really quite important. In a further one that actually was made into a film of sorts. There was a mini series, I think it was National Film Board. Those who are my age might remember this, late 70s, early 1980s, where the Mandamin story was brought to life. And it wasn't that much of a departure from the story on offer in Nanabush and Mandamin in Daphne Ojig's work. And in this story, you have, as opposed to focusing upon work necessary to sustain oneself or to live in well-being in a community, in this story, you have this train of exploration in which he is attempting to come to understand respect for elders and respect for taking instruction from people you ought to trust. That's an oversimplification. The Mandamin creature was one that Nanabush wrestled with. Sometimes in some stories, he's said to have physically fought him. So the rhetoric is a bit different depending on which story you're hearing. And the fruits of his efforts, I suppose, sort of lead us to understand the importance of conscientiousness, doing something that you're either you understand you need to do and say you need to do, and also the importance of seeing the fruits of those righteous activities of sorts, right? The opportunity for children like myself was an opportunity to see how these stories sort of can be mapped on into our own lives and understanding what's worthwhile doing, what sources do we have to come to understand why it's important, and so on. And it's that transfer, this idea that the story comes to be understood by a young child. It might begin to delve into the idea of archetype a little bit, but there's a bit more that needs to be explored here, I think, to come to understand it. But the trickster really wasn't a focus of my work, but Joanne Archibald. She worked at UBC for many years. She recently retired, and she put together that book on story work that's really quite good, and talks about meaning and purpose in ways that are really quite important. You see, Nana Bush serves as this character that helps us remind us, in the words of Joanne, the good power of interconnections with family, with community, with loved ones, with nature, with culture. If we become disconnected, we lose the ability to make meaning from Indigenous stories. So there's this idea that I think we can all get on board with, which is this idea that these stories and the content of them has the supplementary, or actually quite important, role in our lives. They help us to maintain this culture of sorts, which might be quite important in many cases if you don't have, if you are, for instance, not living in your home community like I am, right? Which is the case for what I want to focus on today. We're already at 12:30 here almost. So I want to talk about the Haudenosaunee peoples for a minute, because it's where archetypes are really brought to bear here that I think is important mentioning. You see, I'm going to summarize the story, but I'm worried about that, because there is, it's important to observe that one can't capture the entire story that I'm about to tell, which is the journey of the peacemaker. Sometimes it takes days to tell in a ceremonial context and so on. So I'm going to try to hit some of the major points, and then refer you to one of the principal works written by someone right here at the University of Manitoba that I think might help for anyone who's interested, right? You see, you see the Hiawatha flag in front of us. You've seen it before, I suspect. It is the flag that is intended to represent the 5 nations at the time, now 6. You have from the east going west, the Mohawk, the Oneida, in the middle, the Keepers of the Fire, the Onondaga, and then you have the Cayuga, and then you have the Seneca. So the journey of the peacemaker, it must be understood as within the context as we understand it. The story usually starts with an exploration of where the peoples of that area at that time were. We had warring nations, warring communities. Some characters in the story are the center of that malfeasance in the communities. I'll get to the one in the story in a minute here. And the idea of peacemaking is centered around this one individual. I'll say his name once, and that's intended to sort of just give you an idea of who I'm talking about here. But in many communities, you should refrain from saying that individual's name, and that name is Deganawida. We usually say the word peacemaker in the place of that word Deganawida. And Deganawida would be renamed Skanarahawi. Skana could be understood to mean peace. Skanarahawi, those who make peace. He who makes peace. And this journey starts in the east, and isn't without the main players. Hiawatha was understood. The peacemaker is sometimes said to be Huron in descent, and then got adopted, some say, into another nation. Hiawatha is sometimes said to be of Onondaga descent, and was adopted into the Mohawk community in the past. And the peacemaker, in one particular representation of the story, I don't want to get too much off track here, but is said to have been born in some ways that we see in biblical references, in a special way. Sometimes he said born of a virgin, had special powers or abilities when he was young. And when it came time, late adolescence, early adulthood, the peacemaker decided that the way forward was to not be at battle, was to be at peace, to help war chiefs turn into peace chiefs, and to resituate, in a sense, what it means to be a warrior, to include peoples into those conversations, men, women, young ones, totally across the board. And the peacemaker interfaced with Hiawatha early in this journey. In one story, Hiawatha is understood to be the orator amongst the two. And sometimes the peacemaker is said to have valued Hiawatha's contributions to this peacemaking journey for, among other reasons, because he could speak for him. He could speak on behalf of this idea of peace, and so on. So he started in Mohawk territory, as most stories have it in this order, that they went to the Mohawk, they went to the Cayuga, the Seneca, the Oneida, and then finally to the Onondaga, who were sometimes characterized as the most militant, if you will, led by Tadadaho, which is sometimes said to be an evil character at times. In fact, there's an image of Tadadaho. One person once wrote that the effects of evil and malfeasance had affected him to such a point that his hair began to take that appearance, and his features were changed accordingly. So the ideas around this I can't get into, but the opportunities that the peacemaker takes in this journey is to a variety of things. It's somewhat diplomacy at its most important level, because you have someone who is humble in their approach to leadership, one who is assertive in the ideas fundamentally about peace, and is prepared to absolutely honor the perspectives of those who he's asking for this new relationship. One part of it that shouldn't go without notice here is that it's sometimes said that Jingunzaze is the first acceptor of the message of peace. Jingunzaze was, sometimes I hear her referred to as a clan mother, but certainly the representation of someone who has responsibilities, or her responsibilities might have been apropos of a clan mother, someone who led her communities and so on, and said, yes, this is a good idea. Your ideas for peace are not just important, but essential for well-being. I hope to capture well-being a little bit more in a bit here. And his interface with Hiawatha is really quite important, because you hear sometimes about something called distributed leadership, right? A careful reading of the journey to peacemaker has this idea of distributed leadership quite well laid out. And I think one of the important things to observe in that is that he is willing and prepared to enable somebody who knows more about a particular aspect than somebody else might not. There's a storied part of this where one of they're about to venture into Onondaga territory later on in the story. This is a late portion of the story, it seems to me. And the journey requires them circumventing one physical part of the environment, or going another way and then waiting and so on, right? And initially, the peacemaker is really quite assertive about the way he wishes to go. But then there's these series of conversations in which the peacemaker yields to someone who knows the area quite well. Now, sometimes you could have stories that essentialize the hero character in a certain way, but I think this is really quite important to understanding Skanara Howi's approach to this sort of thing. And even now, you could understand that if you want to be a good leader, whether it's in a community or organization or so on, you need partners. You need people with whom you have relationships with. And they could be of the sort that is nominally of your nation, if you will, but you could, but also, and that's what's important about this, you had nations who were warring, whose experiences at the hands of something like Tadahahu, who they eventually brought on board into the Confederacy, are really quite important. It's at the outset of this portion of the story. Hiawatha's daughters were suffering, and sometimes it says one died, the other didn't. In some other stories, they both died, and that's if you can imagine sort of well-being being understood as the healthy life that your children might lead, then that might be kind of an issue. So the archetypes that are resident in the peacemaker. I could only pick up on a few, but sometimes it's suggested that that a great way of capturing this leadership style is one portion of the story. You see, there's one image that really strikes with, not this particular image, I mean the imagery that's resident in the idea that he was trying to explain the importance of the Confederacy to people at the time. So he took one arrow, broke it, and said, one nation is weak by itself. You put 5 together, it's much, much stronger, right? One part of this story that's important here is the meaning and purpose, to bring that back in, right? What was driving this at some level? So because you had different nations, different communities, the languages were different, and they were existing alongside, to the north and to the south, other nations. So the differences amongst peoples was apparent, and as the story is sometimes told, the people of the time really had difficulty keeping a peace. So what I think is important here is that the importance of well-being, the importance of maintaining peace, can be the meaning that's brought to bear with this, and might be arguably the most important element of this archetypal element. But let me bring it back to the idea of what an archetype is. It's not just a one issue, it's not one item, it's not one element of, in this case, Skanara Howi's leadership. It's as much about an aggregate idea that's resident in a story. The best representation of this story is by our own Brian Rice, in my opinion. Brian is a faculty member in REC, and he wrote a book a few years ago, and it was called, I'm just trying to find the exact name here because it is a fantastic read. The Haudenosaunee, a traditional Iroquoian history through the eyes of Taharo Yawago and Sawiskera. There's an important thing to observe in these stories, is that the episodic reference to somebody might be very helpful in all they have done. But the story of the peacemaker is really quite involved. It takes days to tell the story in its entirety for a reason, because it's that long, it's that important. The journey that he has alongside those other key elements, the representations of good in the version of Taro Iwago, who was a child of, I don't want to get too much into it because I don't have time, the sky woman who fell to the earth, and then on the back of a turtle, she had twins. Sawiskera was the other one. But the ideas around this meaning and purpose can only adequately be observed, in my opinion, through an extent exploration, a deliberate exploration of what these ideas are that are resonant in the story. So you have this sometimes reference the difference between a meme and an archetype. So the meme being the idea that transmit amongst a culture, perhaps for a little while, and then it disappears. And then you have the archetype, which I've described more as a set of ideas, a set of characteristics that can inform behavior, that can be taken on board into one's psyche in such a way that it can, I don't want to say govern, but certainly inform your own behavior. And that's why they're really so important here, right? Joseph Campbell, I think I mentioned him earlier in this lecture. If we're to take the peacemaker to be, in a sense, an archetype of the hero, then I think some of the things that can be said of this journey are really quite important. That he had to navigate with the support of women and men who were committed to this cause for peace. It was the person who was able to battle past local historical limitations, personal limitations. It's said sometimes that the peacemaker had a speech impediment of some sort, which is why he wished Hiawatha to be with him in this journey. Such a one's visions, ideas, and inspirations can come pristine from the primary springs of human life and thought. Here you have an idea of the peacemaker that was embedded in a very long story that if read or listened to deliberately, give you an opportunity to understand what it means in this case to really appreciate peace and how and why, I should say, that peace is important. In the case that I'm trying to put forth, the well-being of people in your own communities, in your nation, in the broader society. Something to be said about this journey of the peacemaker that led to the Confederacy. It is sometimes written that Washington and Franklin, once it came time to develop their own constitution, did have a great deal of appreciation for the Confederacy that resulted in this idea of peace. The explorations of the Rediscanagete, I didn't introduce that word, it's in Mohawk, that's the word we use for warriors, is really quite central to this transformation and rejuvenation, if you will, of the idea of the Rediscanagete, not as warriors, really, but rather as the bearers of the burden of peace. And their leadership is quite important, but of course they are supported by the network of clan mothers in some places. So that's really quite important. So these stories are a way of looking at morality through the use of these archetypes. It's something that I grew up with. It's something that I am seeing in many schools and many classrooms. And it seems to me that this is one way in which we can explore how Indigenous consciousness, if you want to say it's resident belief systems, if you want to say it's belief in morality, or it might be valuable just because it is an Indigenous story that comes from the community at that level, then that's terribly important too. I just talk about this in this way because that's what's emerging from the conversations I'm having with community members and classroom teachers. So one last point, why is this important to education? Because deliberate explorations of this sort, and I can't recommend Brian Rice's book enough. It's a lengthy read. It can be a very involved read, but it's an important one, I think. When introduced these stories of this sort and really giving students an opportunity to explore what this archetype of a hero, the Jungian framework, if you will, of archetypes is really quite extant. They're sometimes tied to life episodes or specific roles. The archetype of the trickster is a popular one, the archetype of the elder of sorts, and so on. They're really quite important. These archetypes don't have just a single message. They don't have just a single idea. It is a collection of things, of ideas, of characteristics that a child or people should really engage with, and then make up their own minds about how this might work within their own context, with their, as they venture to come to an understanding of moral truth. I'm going to stop there. It's already 1:45. I've talked a lot, so that's my exploration. Again, it might have been a sort of an opportunity to talk more about a particular story, but it's one that I have no apologies for, because it's one of those examples from where I come from about the archetypes and what we can learn from how we could use those to guide our own moral journey. So Nyawagoa, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Deere. That was very, very interesting. And
you can call me Frank.
So sorry, Frank. Yeah, Frank and I used to work in the same office, but you know, I want to be respectful of your title and credentials there as well. So thank you very much. Very interesting, and I'm glad we're recording this, because I think there's a few things I'd like to go back and rewatch just to kind of wrap my mind around them a little bit more. At this time, I'd really like to open up the floor to questions. You can use the chat if you're on Zoom. I know some folks are watching on Facebook. The comment section there is being monitored, and those questions are being sent to us to ask to Frank. And so I'm just looking to see if anyone, also if you want to just put up your hand, you can ask Frank a question live here. So I'm just looking through see if anyone has their hand up. And of course, I live in a condo building and someone's vacuuming right now. Okay, I don't see any hands up. I don't see any questions in the chat. So I think one thing I'd like to ask is just, so you were once an elementary school teacher. So I'm just wondering, you're talking about Dr. Rice's book, and you mentioned how it is long, and how, you know, there are some of these stories that are told over several days and done in ceremony. So how can elementary school educators introduce some of this content into their classrooms?
Thank you for the question. The most one of the most successful models for exploring such things, and something similar can be said of language education or anything else that's germane to community understandings of who you are and what you might value, right? Is community interface of sorts, right? This isn't about this story. This is maybe a bit different, but let me just tell it anyway, because I think it's important. I was once a supervisor of students who are doing their practicum teaching in a school, right? And I was having one supervision. I was driving up to Fisher River. There we go. And the school there had high school, and this young man was doing his final practicum in Fisher River. And I went there. He was doing physical education, and I was expecting the common physical education observation. We'd go in a gym, implements of some sort like basketballs would handed out, there'd be some teaching, and then the physical education class would occur anyway. It's grade 11, grade 12, so if you understand that, there's maybe a larger, more extant opportunity there, which he took on board with because he had a Native Studies background and he's from the area. And there was a classroom opportunity there when I walked in at 9 o'clock in the morning. It was, and it lasted about 30 minutes, where he was talking about what he would be doing with the class that time. And then 30 minutes later, we're in the middle of the lake with the class, with the cooperating teacher, and with two people who I initially didn't know who they were, but one was later identified and introduced to me as an elder, and the other just a community helper. And they were doing ice fishing as a part of this exploration, right? And in conversation, you know, you never want to say anything's impossible, but the opportunity that was on offer there for him to use, to invite people from the community to help through this process for the purposes of not him getting a successful observation with me, but to help in the learning of the students was really quite important. So I see something similar going on there. When I was young, the elementary school teachers did have some knowledge of this, of course, but we didn't do these learnings in the school. We went to what we called the 207 Longhouse, 207 in reference to a highway in the community where the Longhouse was. And we would hear about these stories. We would hear about them elsewhere too, but it wasn't episodic. There wasn't a week where we did the Peacemaker and then we went on with maths and science and whatever, right? This is something that we talked about all the time. And it was sometimes resident in some of the conversations of a spiritual sort, I guess I'll put it, because this is one element of a grander community identity that was always there. It started in the morning when we said the morning Thanksgiving address, the Ahando Gare Watekwa, we call it. It would be there when we learned about things that you might call, we would put under the umbrella of Indigenous studies. There were just studies for us, right? And so on, right? So it's to answer your question there, there's these opportunities that can be sought out. And if you work hard enough, you'll find some support if it's acceptable to do so, and if you get support from the community. So that community interface is incredibly important. It's great to see some school districts in the city even having some supports of certain sorts, whether they're elders or community folk who are doing some work and guiding the things that are acceptable to do in school contexts.
Thank you for that. It sounds like a really exciting time to actually be a student as well as an educator. There's a question from Kimberly Lenz in the chat, so I'm just going to read it. You mentioned that the 7 teachings are ubiquitous in schools. Are there any resources that you would suggest to integrate this information in higher education?
Yes. Probably lots. In an academic sense, I've relied on some of the work that's out there, but in regard to schools, there is a burgeoning canon, if you will. I kind of don't like using that word, but whatever, of works that are really quite useful for young readers and young children. I'll put a link up to a couple of things. Hopefully, maybe I don't have them I don't have them there, but they're out there, I assure you. And they have been used in many of the schools. And sometimes I do have student teachers when I'm working in the schools who are really quite happy to know more about these sort of things. And it's just not terribly resident just in literatures, but you have this framework of, I'll call it morality, but sometimes it can be characterized other ways, that's brought to bear by elders and so on, who are ready to share and talk about these sort of things and really turn it into a conversation about how can you navigate our complicated world and all the relationships and responsibilities that are resident in it, whilst maintaining a sense of the importance of honesty, the importance of courage, the importance of, so there's lots out there.
Okay, so we have a question from Facebook from Natasha. When teaching elementary and high school age students about walking in a good way with regards to anti-bullying, anti-transphobia, anti-homophobia, preventing and addressing all gender-based violence with children and youth, what resources have been useful and how have these teachings and extensions for student reflections and, say, culminating activity?
Thank you for the question. It's not necessarily a topic that was explored for consideration of Indigenous peoples, but there was one book on gender issues that came out a few years ago. The gentleman came to the University of Manitoba in discussion, and I'm trying to recall their name, but it was an exploration of the importance of pronoun use, essentially, right? And sometimes when I am hearing the tough struggles of anybody, but particularly people in schools, And because I'm in the school, sometimes you sometimes get a sense that there is an awareness of this issue of sorts. I almost want to draw up the question to make sure I'm answering the right one. But the idea of, of being respectful of those sort of things can be exactly that, right? The pronoun debate, I'll focus on that because I heard that resident in the question. Ruth, tell me if I'm not answering the question correctly here. But the y'all hear the arguments or heated conversation about whether the word Indigenous is capitalized, okay? And I listen to these, and some it's about respect and so on, and I don't dismiss that. But I find it interesting that those conversations occur mostly with a retention of the idea that this English grammatical consideration is almost the principal concern for this English word. A word for which is supposed to codify or explain or define probably a great deal of people on this call, right? If you are concerned about such things, then that's fine. But I find it a distraction, right? So I can't necessarily control directly people's behavior towards me, right? But I can certainly affect sort of the way people come to understand me, right? So if we're going to, have concerns about whether or not the word Indigenous is capitalized or not, that's great. But I'm Ungwehunwe. I'm, as Ruth said at the outset, Ganyankahaga. I'm gonna waget rono, right? So let's have a concern about that, right? But on the bringing it back to this pronoun issue, if someone says that I know who I am, I understand who I am, therefore I have this way of capturing that, whether it's in a word or it's a phrase, then that's absolutely important to me understanding who they are, not just even just the word that they use. If you have an opportunity to come to understand why that word is used, that could be as important as the word itself too. Not that it's any of my business sometimes, right? The point I'm trying to make is that the responsibility is on all of us to come to understand or come to respect that journey that others have to communicate or to share who they are. So if somebody calls me Indigenous, okay, I get it. But can we sort of explore something just a little bit more important, just a little bit unique? Carrie Miller was on the meeting this morning. I believe it was Carrie or it was Catherine Cook, who said that, one observation down south is that you don't see as much of the word tribal or Indian. You see the terminology of their people, right? So that's for their concern. And then there's my responsibility to engage with that at a level that not only honors that, but certainly it's really, as Mary Sinclair said, it's coming to a new relationship, and the features of that relationship are, they may even start with an exploration of what those references are. So
thank you so much, Dr. Dear Frank. So it is 1 o'clock exactly on the nose. We did schedule this session to end at 1. So I know
Mantic has a question there.
I do see that David does have a question, so we'll let him ask the final question. And yeah, just turn on your mic.
He's my former dean, so I can't really say no.
I could always take this offline, but I was struck, Frank, and I'm mindful of the time, so I'll make it quick. Struck about your talk about Nanabush, and the covers that you shared with us reminded me of the Nanabush books that I used to have in my classroom when I started my teaching career in the 70s and 80s. And I think it brought me back to, and it forced me to think about how I use those books in my teaching, and whether or not I, encourage my kids at the time, they would have been in the elementary grades, to think about the fact that we've got a little bit of Nanabush in each of us, and whether or not I encourage them to pay attention to the cues in nature and community and family for keeping us in line and for teaching us those moral lessons along the way. And I thought to myself, it would be very interesting study to look at how teachers engage with their students in these kinds of moral lessons through Indigenous literature, maybe using Nanabush and other stories. Do you know of any research in that way?
Yep. So I can't cite anybody who is nominally done in works Indigenous that I can share with you in a way that I think your question leads. But there was generally a publication that still exists. It was in a series. It's called The Broken Flute, an exploration of different. It was basically a collection of literary criticism, right? And it's evolved over time. There was, and it's evolved. I mean that in the sense that what was once appreciated, maybe not so appreciated now. Cultural appropriation and the appropriation of modes of exploring or expressing, for instance, even language at times, it didn't appear to be as much a part of the conversations maybe 30 years ago when the first editions of The Broken Flute, I'm pretty sure I got that title right. But the more recent ones certainly do. They certainly have provided us with an opportunity to understand what's accurate to, or what's appropriate to be doing in the realm of Indigenous literature. But you did start off by saying there's a little bit of the trickster in all of us. And you're not wrong, right? One of the things I mentioned, the very well-known Joanne Archibald. This is someone, the trickster in this case, who is sometimes represented as someone who gets to know good, is sometimes not in keeping with the cultural mores of community, so on, is a person or individual or sometimes a creature with humanness, if you will, situated, that does exhibit vanity, greed, selfishness, and so on, right? So I don't disagree with you with that. The idea here is to be exploring these things like the Nanabush stories that you noticed, but there's other. David, oh dear, he does the graphic novels. David Robertson does a great work with some explorations right here in Winnipeg with characters for which, if you look through the series, if you come to understand what he's tussling with, these dreams that he has of the past and how he maps that onto the future, it's like an archetype inside of an archetype, right? Yeah. One who's coming to understand who he is or what his ancestors were, and how that can map onto his experience here, right? So he's taking on archetypes in his own way, perhaps, and that could be understand his journey, which has all of the stereotypical markers, if you will, of North End life is what's focused in one portion of that. So it is really quite important to be deliberate to answer your question about how you explore these sort of things. So
yeah, enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
So I think we are going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, Frank, Dr. Deere, for this presentation today, and for everyone who attended, the great questions. Normally at this time we would give you a thank you card, but we can't do that in person, so we'll put that in the mail or we'll drop it off to you. I just want to let everyone on the call still know that the speaker next month is Dr. Sarah Goulet from the Max Rady College of Medicine. So please save the date. That's on Thursday, February 25th. And her talk is titled Two-Eyed Seeing, Weaving Indigenous Ways of Knowing with Western Knowledge Systems. And I also just want to thank my incredible colleagues who made this year's Indigenous Scholar Speaker Series possible. So Sarah Olson coordinated this year's lineup. I know she's been having a little bit of technical difficulty today, but she's managed to keep us running. So, and then Nikita Longman, who looks after the communications and promotion for the series. And we had a really good turnout today. There was people both here and on Facebook. So thank you everyone again for joining us. And again, thank you, Dr. Deere.